London, April 1817. The Royal Opera House stood resplendent in the spring evening, its columns illuminated by hundreds of flickering gas lamps that cast dancing shadows across the eager crowds gathering beneath its portico. Inside, the grand theatre hummed with anticipation, the air thick with the mingled scents of beeswax candles, expensive perfumes, and the faint mustiness of velvet curtains that had absorbed 1,000 performances. Eleanor Whitmore sat in the third-tier box that her family had occupied for the past 10 years, her gloved hands folded carefully in her lap, her posture impeccable despite the discomfort of stays that seemed tighter this season than last. At 28, she had learned to make herself small, to occupy space without drawing attention, to exist in the margins of glittering social occasions like a footnote in an otherwise sparkling text. The theatre filled around her with the cream of London society, ladies in silk gowns of ivory and pale blue and rose, gentlemen in immaculate black evening dress, the accumulated wealth and beauty of the ton on spectacular display. Her mother, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, sat to her right, adjusting her widow's cap with nervous fingers, ever conscious of their somewhat diminished position since Mr. Whitmore's death 5 years prior. To her left, her younger sister Lydia, now Mrs. Lydia Harcourt these past 2 years, glowed with the particular radiance that exceptional beauty confers, her golden curls arranged in artful ringlets, her complexion like cream, her figure the subject of admiring glances from every box and stall. Eleanor had long ago accepted that she would always be the shadow to Lydia's light, the plain elder sister whose function was to provide contrast, to make beauty more beautiful by proximity to ordinariness. The orchestra began tuning their instruments, that discordant symphony of preparation that always made Eleanor's heart quicken despite herself, for if society found her lacking in every grace that mattered, music had always offered her refuge, a private kingdom where she needed no beauty or youth or marriageable charm to find belonging. She knew every opera in the season's repertoire, had studied the scores, understood the structure and genius of the compositions in ways that her more socially successful peers never troubled themselves to do. Tonight's performance was Mozart, The Marriage of Figaro, and Eleanor felt the familiar tingle of anticipation as the house lights began to dim, as conversations dropped to whispers, as the conductor raised his baton. For the next 3 hours she could forget that she was a spinster, an embarrassment, a cautionary tale mothers used to frighten their daughters into accepting proposals before time ran out. For 3 hours she could simply be. The first act concluded with a cascade of applause that rippled through the theatre like a wave, and Eleanor rose with the rest of her family as the house lights brightened, illuminating faces flushed with pleasure and the animated chatter that always accompanied intermission. Her mother suggested they take some air in the corridor, perhaps procure some refreshment, and Eleanor followed dutifully, knowing that these intervals were less about comfort than about being seen, about the careful navigation of social waters in which she had learned to move with the invisibility of someone who expected nothing, and was therefore rarely disappointed. The corridor outside the boxes teemed with London's finest, gentlemen in their black evening dress gathered in clusters discussing politics and horses, ladies in their pastel silks whispering behind fans, the whole glittering machinery of society on full display. Eleanor stood slightly behind her mother and sister, her usual position, her eyes tracing the ornate plasterwork of the ceiling rather than seeking engagement with the crowd. It was then that she heard the voice, loud and carrying, edged with the particular cruelty that some men mistake for wit. Viscount Pembroke stood not 10 feet away, his back partially turned, addressing a small group of fellow gentlemen with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his right to pronounce judgment on others. "The Whitmore ladies," he was saying, "such a study in contrasts, the younger a diamond of the first water, and the elder, well, remarkably plain, past any hope of matrimony, I should think, 28 if she is a day, and without a single feature to recommend her. His companions laughed, that easy, masculine laughter that costs nothing and wounds everything, and Eleanor felt the words land in her chest like stones dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward, disturbing the careful calm she had cultivated over years of similar assessments. She did not move, did not flinch, had learned long ago that reaction only invited further comment, but she felt her mother's hand suddenly on her arm, the pressure both comforting and confirming, for Mrs. Whitmore had heard it too. The pity in her mother's eyes was almost worse than the Viscount's words, that sorrowful acknowledgment that what he said was not untrue, merely unkind in its public utterance. Lydia, blessedly, had been engaged in conversation with an acquaintance and seemed not to have noticed, but Eleanor felt the familiar burning behind her eyes that signaled tears she could not shed in this public place. She murmured something about needing a moment, extracted herself from her mother's gentle grip, and moved with careful dignity toward the ladies' retiring room, her spine straight, her pace measured, giving no indication that she had just heard her worst fears about herself, confirmed by a man whose opinion society valued simply because he possessed a title and an adequate fortune. The corridor seemed endless, the chattering crowds a gauntlet she must pass through, while maintaining the composure that was perhaps her only remaining claim to respectability, and she concentrated on breathing, on placing one foot before the other, on reaching sanctuary before the facade crumbled entirely. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The ladies' retiring room offered temporary refuge, a quiet chamber with mirrors and settees where Eleanor could press her gloved hands against the cool marble of the washstand and study her reflection with the pitiless clarity that the Viscount's words had sharpened into focus. Unremarkable brown hair, neither abundant nor particularly lustrous, styled in a simple arrangement that her mother's limited budget could afford. Eyes of an indeterminate hazel that shifted between grey and green depending on the light, but never achieved the striking quality that might compensate for other deficiencies. A nose slightly too long, a mouth neither full nor delicate, a chin that could charitably be called firm and less charitably called strong. She catalogued her inadequacies with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this inventory countless times across 3 failed London seasons, each one a diminishing parade of hope turned to resignation as gentlemen's eyes slid past her to rest on Lydia's golden perfection. The first season, when she was 19, she had still believed that wit and accomplishment might compensate for beauty's absence, had imagined that her genuine love of literature and music, her ability to converse intelligently on subjects beyond weather and fashion, might attract a gentleman of similar intellectual inclinations. The second season had taught her that such gentlemen, if they existed at all, were already married or had no intention of seeking wives among the daughters of minor gentry with modest dowries. The third season, at 21, she had attended with the grim determination of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than pursuing a dream, and when it concluded without a single serious offer, she had felt less disappointment than relief that the charade was finally over. Since then, she had crafted a life of small dignities and private pleasures, her days filled with music she played only when alone, books she ordered from the lending library and consumed in the quiet of her room, needlework that gave her hands purpose and her mind the freedom to wander into imaginative landscapes where appearance mattered less than the content of one's character. She had become the maiden aunt before there were nieces or nephews to aunt, had accepted that her function was to support her mother in widowhood, to admire Lydia's children when they eventually arrived, to fade gradually into the wallpaper of other people's lives with grace and without complaint. She had built walls around hope itself, recognizing it as the enemy of peace. For hope invited disappointment, and disappointment was a luxury she could no longer afford. The Viscount's words had not told her anything she did not already know, had merely given public voice to the private verdict she had long ago pronounced upon herself. Yet hearing it spoken aloud in that glittering corridor had somehow made it more real, more final, a door closing that she had not realized might still have been fractionally ajar. She straightened her spine, smoothed her modest gown of dove-grey silk that her mother had insisted was elegant in its simplicity, though Eleanor knew it for what it was, an acknowledgment that she was past the age for girlish pastels, and prepared to return to the box for the second act, where she would lose herself once more in Mozart's genius, and forget for a few blessed hours that she was Eleanor Whitmore, spinster, plain, and past all hope. From the private box on the second tier, positioned with the strategic advantage that wealth and title afforded, Alexander Sinclair, Duke of Ashworth, had been observing the evening's proceedings with the detached interest of a man who attended such events more from obligation than enthusiasm. At 35, he had been back in London for only a fortnight after 2 years of self-imposed exile at his country estate in Derbyshire, where he had retreated following the death of his wife Catherine from a fever that had taken her with shocking swiftness, leaving him alone in a vast house filled with memories and the echoing absence of her laughter. Society had begun to murmur that his mourning had extended beyond what was proper, that a duke had responsibilities that included producing an heir, that he must think of remarrying. But Alexander found the prospect exhausting and faintly distasteful, for he had genuinely loved Catherine, and the thought of subjecting himself once more to the marriage market, with its calculated displays and mercenary mothers, filled him with a weariness that went bone deep. He had come to the opera this evening because his man of business had suggested that continued absence from town would be remarked upon, and because music had been one of the few pleasures that still reached him through the grey fog of his grief, Mozart's genius transcending even sorrow. The intermission had drawn him to the front of his box, where he could observe the crowd below, that glittering mass of humanity engaged in the ancient rituals of display and assessment, and it was then that he had witnessed the scene in the corridor. His position afforded him both visual and auditory access, and he had heard the Viscount Pembroke's pronouncement with perfect clarity, had seen the words strike the young woman in grey like a physical blow, though she gave no outward sign beyond a slight stiffening of her shoulders. What arrested Alexander's attention was not the cruelty itself, for he had long ago concluded that Pembroke was a fool whose title exceeded his character by a considerable margin, but rather the woman's response to it, or more precisely, her lack of response. She did not weep, did not flee, did not even alter her expression beyond a brief flicker that might have been pain, or might have been something deeper, some ancient recognition that this was merely confirmation of verdicts already internalized. Instead, she had moved with extraordinary dignity toward the retiring rooms, her carriage erect, her pace measured, and Alexander had found himself leaning forward slightly, studying her profile as she passed beneath his box, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the fineness of her bone structure that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with character written in the architecture of a face. He thought of Catherine, who had been beautiful by any measure, but whose beauty had been the least interesting thing about her, and he thought of the empty years stretching ahead in which he was expected to select some appropriate ornament to fill the position of Duchess, and something in him, some part that he had thought permanently frozen, stirred with an emotion he could not immediately name. The young woman disappeared into the retiring rooms, her mother following with a solicitude that spoke of love and pity intermingled, and Alexander remained standing at the edge of his box, his mind working with unusual speed and clarity, turning over possibilities and consequences, aware that he stood at one of those peculiar junctures where a single decision might alter the trajectory of multiple lives. Alexander returned to his seat as the second act commenced, but the music that had drawn him to the opera house in the first place now served merely as backdrop to the thoughts turning with unusual velocity through his mind, thoughts that circled around that moment in the corridor and the woman in grey who had absorbed cruelty with such devastating composure. He was not a man given to impulse, his temperament having always tended toward careful consideration and measured action, qualities that had served him well in managing his considerable estates and navigating the treacherous waters of political life. Yet something in what he had witnessed had penetrated the careful insulation he had wrapped around himself since Catherine's death. For 2 years he had moved through the world as though separated from it by a pane of glass, able to observe but not truly participate, performing his duties with mechanical precision while feeling nothing, or rather feeling only the grey fog of grief that had settled over everything, like November mist obscuring a landscape that had once been familiar and beloved. Catherine had been his partner in the truest sense, a woman whose lively intelligence and genuine warmth had made their marriage a sanctuary from the artifice and calculation that characterized so much of aristocratic life. And when the fever had taken her in a matter of days, leaving him standing beside her bed holding a hand that had already grown cold, something in him had simply stopped, a clock whose mechanism had ceased its reliable ticking. Society had been patient at first, understanding that a man needed time to mourn a wife he had actually loved rather than merely married for dynastic convenience. But patience had limits, and whispers had begun about his duty to his title, his need to produce an heir, the waste of allowing such a fortune and position to languish without proper stewardship of succession. He had ignored these whispers with the privileged indifference of a duke who need answer to no one. But beneath the indifference lay a deeper dread, for the thought of subjecting himself again to the marriage market, of evaluating and being evaluated like livestock at a fair, of selecting some appropriate young woman based on bloodline and dowry and the symmetry of her features, filled him with a revulsion so profound it bordered on nausea. Yet watching that woman in the corridor absorb the Viscount's casual cruelty, seeing in her response not weakness but a terrible strength born of long practice at enduring dismissal, he had felt something shift, some recognition that here was a person who understood what it meant to be truly alone, even in the midst of society's glittering crowds. There was no calculation in her bearing, no performance, merely an authentic dignity that required no audience to exist, and Alexander found himself thinking that such dignity was rarer and more valuable than all the celebrated beauty in London's ballrooms. An idea had begun to form, nebulous at first, but gaining definition as he sat in his box only half attending to Mozart's Genius. An idea that was part impulse and part strategy and part something he could not yet name, but that felt surprisingly like the first stirring of genuine interest he had experienced since Catherine's death. By the time the final curtain fell and the audience rose in thunderous applause, Alexander had made his decision, though he could not have fully articulated what that decision entailed, beyond a bone-deep certainty that he would see the woman in grey again, that he would discover whether the quality he had glimpsed in that brief moment of observation was as genuine as it had appeared, and that perhaps in doing so he might find his own way back to something resembling life. 3 days passed, during which Eleanor retreated into the familiar routines that structured her quiet existence, finding solace in the leather-bound volumes of poetry that lined the shelves of her father's former study, a room that had become her sanctuary since his death 5 years prior, and in the meticulous needlework that occupied her hands while leaving her mind free to wander through landscapes more forgiving than the glittering ballrooms of Mayfair. She had not spoken of the incident at the opera to anyone, though she suspected from her mother's unusually gentle manner and Lydia's careful avoidance of the subject that they too had heard the Viscount's pronouncement, and the knowledge that her humiliation had been witnessed by those she loved added another layer of mortification to the memory that she was trying, with limited success, to relegate to the vast internal archive of slights and dismissals she had learned over the years to simply endure. It was therefore with surprise rather than interest that she looked up from her embroidery on the third afternoon to find her mother entering the drawing-room with a most peculiar expression, something between astonishment and calculation, holding the morning's copy of the Times as though it contained intelligence of national significance rather than the usual accounts of political maneuvering and society gossip. Mother settled into her accustomed chair with an air of barely suppressed excitement that immediately put Eleanor on guard, for she had learned that her mother's enthusiasms regarding society matters rarely boded well for her own peace of mind, and indeed the words that followed confirmed her instinctive wariness. The Duke of Ashworth, her mother announced with the gravity of one reporting a military victory, had purchased the Royal Opera House in its entirety, an acquisition that had apparently required a sum so extraordinary that even the newspapers' typically restrained reporting conveyed something approaching shock, and all of London was buzzing with speculation about what could have motivated such an unprecedented transaction. Eleanor's first thought, delivered with the practical detachment she had cultivated as armor against disappointment, was that dukes did inexplicable things simply because they could, and that the financial maneuvers of the aristocracy had no relevance whatsoever to her own circumstances. Her mother continued with mounting animation, recounting the theories circulating through drawing-rooms across Mayfair, suggestions that the Duke intended to renovate the building, or establish it as some sort of monument to his late wife, or assert his position in society after his long absence, each speculation more elaborate than the last. And Eleanor listened with the patient tolerance of one who has heard countless society tales and found them all equally remote from her actual life. She returned her attention to her needlework, the familiar rhythm of needle through fabric providing a meditative anchor, and privately resolved that she would not attend the opera again this season, for the memory of that corridor and the Viscount's words had tainted what had been one of her few reliable pleasures, and she would not subject herself to the possibility of repetition. Better to remain here in this quiet room with her books and her needlework and the small dignities of an existence that required nothing from society and therefore could not be disappointed by its judgments. And if this retreat felt more like defeat than wisdom, well, she had become adept at not examining such distinctions too closely. The invitation arrived on heavy cream stationery that bore the ducal seal of Ashworth, delivered by a liveried footman whose very presence at their modest townhouse door sent the household into a state of barely controlled chaos. And Eleanor stood in the hallway watching her mother's hands tremble slightly as she broke the wax seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper whose contents would somehow, though Eleanor did not yet understand how, alter the careful equilibrium she had constructed around her disappointments. The Duke of Ashworth requested the honour of the Whitmore family's presence at the Royal Opera House as his personal guests for a performance of Don Giovanni on Friday evening, the note explained in an elegant masculine hand that suggested education and care rather than the careless scrawl affected by so many fashionable gentlemen, and he had taken the liberty of reserving his private box for their exclusive comfort, hoping that they might do him the kindness of accepting this small gesture of hospitality. Eleanor's mother read the invitation aloud 3 times, as though repetition might reveal some hidden meaning in the courteous phrases, her voice rising with each iteration until even the usually unflappable housekeeper emerged from the kitchen to learn what occasion warranted such excitement. And when the contents had been thoroughly communicated to every member of the household staff, her mother turned to Eleanor with an expression of such triumphant hope that Eleanor felt her stomach sink with a dread she could not have fully articulated. This was pity, she told herself, some elaborate aristocratic gesture born of noblesse oblige, the Duke having perhaps witnessed or heard of the Viscount's cruelty, and decided in a moment of charitable impulse to offer compensation in the form of this invitation, and the prospect of sitting in his private box while society whispered and speculated about why the Duke of Ashworth would bother with the plain Miss Whitmore filled her with a humiliation so acute it bordered on nausea. She wanted to refuse, to plead a headache or prior commitment, to remain safely within the walls of this house where expectations had been reduced to manageable dimensions and disappointment had lost its power through sheer repetition. But her mother was already planning what they would wear, already calculating the social currency of being seen as guests of a duke, already reviving hopes that Eleanor had thought finally and mercifully buried after 3 failed seasons and 8 years of increasing invisibility. The Viscount's words echoed in her mind like a curse that had taken physical form, remarkably plain, past any hope of matrimony, and she could not shake the conviction that accepting this invitation would somehow expose her to an even more public form of that same judgment, that whatever kindness motivated the Duke's gesture would only highlight by contrast how unworthy she was of such attention. Yet refusal was impossible, for her mother's happiness hung in the balance, and Eleanor had long ago learned that her own comfort mattered less than maintaining the fragile peace of their household. So she nodded her acceptance and retreated to her room, where she sat by the window looking out at the grey London sky and wondered how one endured kindness that felt more painful than cruelty, how one accepted gestures of regard when every instinct screamed that such regard could only be a mistake or a game whose rules she did not understand. The evening arrived with that peculiar quality of inevitability that Eleanor had come to associate with social occasions she dreaded, and she found herself standing in the grand lobby of the Royal Opera House, wearing her most presentable gown of deep bronze silk that her mother insisted brought warmth to her complexion, though Eleanor suspected it merely made her look less washed out than usual, her hands fidgeting with her reticule as the crowd parted almost unconsciously to allow the Whitmore family passage toward the sweeping staircase that led to the private boxes, and she was acutely aware of the whispers that followed their progress, the speculative glances from matrons and debutantes alike, who were clearly wondering what possible reason the Duke of Ashworth could have for extending such an invitation to the unremarkable Miss Whitmore. The private box itself was a revelation of luxury that made Eleanor feel even more out of place. All burgundy velvet and gilded scrollwork, positioned at the perfect angle to view both stage and auditorium. And when the Duke of Ashworth rose from his seat to greet them, Eleanor experienced a jolt of recognition that he was even more imposing up close than he had appeared from a distance, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair silvered at the temples and eyes of such startling grey that she found herself looking away after the briefest moment of contact, certain that such eyes must see all her inadequacies laid bare. Her mother and sister were seated with careful ceremony, but it was when the Duke turned his full attention to Eleanor, offering her the seat directly beside his own, with a grave courtesy that suggested this placement was deliberate rather than accidental, that she felt the first stirring of something more complicated than simple dread, a confusion that only deepened when the performance began, and he leaned slightly toward her during the opening aria, to ask in a voice pitched for her ears alone what she thought of the soprano's interpretation of the role. The question caught her so completely off guard that she answered without the usual self-censoring caution that governed her social interactions, commenting that, while the voice was technically proficient, there was a certain coldness in the delivery that failed to capture Donna Anna's anguish, and she saw something shift in his expression, a sharpening of interest that made her heart beat faster with anxiety until he responded that he had thought precisely the same thing and had begun to wonder if he was being unreasonably critical. They spoke in whispers throughout the first act, his questions drawing from her observations about musical phrasing and dramatic choice that she had never before voiced aloud because no one had ever asked, no one had ever suggested that her opinions on such matters might be worth hearing, and she found herself forgetting to maintain the careful guard she had constructed around her thoughts, forgetting even to worry about how she must appear to the rest of the audience, who could surely see the Duke of Ashworth leaning close to the plain Miss Whitmore as though her words held genuine value. During the interval, when her mother and sister excused themselves to promenade through the lobby and be seen in the Duke's company, Eleanor found herself alone with Alexander Sinclair in the intimate confines of the box, and the silence that descended felt weighted with expectation, until he spoke in a voice that had lost the formal edge of earlier and carried instead a quality of genuine reflection, telling her that his late wife, Catherine, had possessed a passion for music that had often surpassed his own understanding, and he had spent the 2 years since her death unable to attend performances because every aria reminded him of her absence. But tonight, for the first time, he had found himself listening to the music itself rather than the echo of his grief. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest at this confession, recognizing in his words a loneliness that mirrored her own isolation, though its source was entirely different, and she found herself responding with an honesty that surprised her, saying that she had always found in music a companion that asked nothing of her appearance or marriageability, that the beauty of a perfectly executed passage existed independent of the listener's worthiness to receive it. He turned to look at her, then with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she saw in his grey eyes not pity or charitable condescension, but something that looked remarkably like recognition, as though he had discovered in her someone who understood a language he had thought himself alone in speaking. They talked through the entire interval about composers living and dead, about the particular ache of Mozart's Requiem, and the mathematical precision hidden within Bach's seemingly effortless fugues, and Eleanor felt a dangerous warmth spreading through her defenses as she realized that the Duke was not simply being polite, but was genuinely engaged, challenging her observations with his own and listening to her responses as though they mattered. When her mother and sister returned, flushed with the triumph of being envied throughout the lobby, Alexander rose with formal courtesy, but his gaze remained on Eleanor as he asked if he might have permission to call upon the Whitmore family at their earliest convenience, and though the question was properly directed to her mother, Eleanor understood with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her that the visit would be meant primarily for her. Her mother's acceptance was immediate and effusive, and as the second act began, Eleanor sat in a state of suspended disbelief, aware of the whispers that would already be circulating through the theatre, aware that Lady Pemberton in the box across the way was staring at them with unconcealed speculation, aware most of all that the Duke of Ashworth's attention had not wandered to her beautiful sister even once during the entire evening, but had remained fixed on Eleanor herself with a focus that defied every expectation society had trained her to accept about her own invisibility. The Duke of Ashworth called upon the Whitmore residence in Bloomsbury Square precisely 2 days after the opera, arriving in a carriage so fine that it drew the attention of every neighbour fortunate enough to witness its approach, and Eleanor watched from the drawing-room window with her heart climbing into her throat as Alexander Sinclair descended with that particular grace that came from a lifetime of aristocratic bearing, dressed in a coat of dark blue superfine that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, and carrying a small package wrapped in paper that her mother would later discover contained a first edition of Wordsworth's poems, which he presented to Eleanor with the casual comment that he had recalled her mentioning an appreciation for the romantic poets during their conversation at the opera. That first visit set a pattern that would repeat with remarkable consistency over the following 3 weeks, Alexander calling every other day with a regularity that had her mother in transports of speculation and Eleanor herself suspended in a state of cautious disbelief. And what astonished her most profoundly was not simply that he came, but that his attention remained so unmistakably fixed upon Eleanor rather than upon Lydia, who was present for propriety's sake, and whose beauty seemed to make no impression whatsoever upon a man who instead asked Eleanor's opinion on the latest exhibit at the Royal Academy, and listened to her response with a focus that suggested he genuinely cared about her thoughts on the use of light in Turner's landscapes. On the 4th visit, he suggested a walk in Hyde Park, and Eleanor found herself strolling along the Serpentine with a duke at her side, while society's most elevated members paused in their own promenades to stare with unconcealed shock at the sight, and she was acutely conscious of how they must appear. Alexander so distinguished in his bearing, and herself so thoroughly ordinary beside him. But when she ventured a self-deprecating comment about the spectacle they were creating, he turned to her with an expression of such genuine confusion that she realized he had not even noticed the attention they were attracting because he had been too engaged in their discussion of whether Beethoven's later symphonies represented an evolution or a departure from classical form. Their conversations ranged across literature and philosophy, music and art, and Eleanor discovered that Alexander possessed not just education, but genuine curiosity, a mind that delighted in engaging with ideas rather than simply displaying knowledge. And more remarkably, he seemed to delight in her own observations, with an enthusiasm that made her forget to second-guess every word before she spoke it. During their 6th walk, as autumn was beginning to paint the park in shades of amber and gold, he asked about her childhood and listened with evident interest as she described growing up in the shadow of Lydia's effortless beauty, and when she attempted to pass over the pain of those years with practiced lightness, he stopped walking entirely and said with quiet intensity that he found it remarkable how society could be so collectively blind to substance in its obsession with surface. And the way he looked at her when he said it made Eleanor's carefully constructed walls tremble in their foundations. The fragile hope that had been growing in Eleanor's heart over the past weeks shattered with the precision of crystal striking marble floor when she attended Lady Harrington's ball on the 15th of October and encountered Viscount Pembroke near the refreshment tables, his voice carrying with that particular projection that suggested he intended to be overheard as he remarked to his companion Lord Whitley that the spectacle of the Duke of Ashworth's recent attentions to Miss Whitmore had provided endless entertainment to those with the wit to perceive it, wondering aloud what charitable impulse, or perhaps what private wager could possibly explain a man of Ashworth's standing, devoting such concentrated effort to the cultivation of a woman so thoroughly unremarkable in every particular. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as she stood frozen behind a pillar of autumn flowers, her hand trembling so violently that the glass of lemonade she held threatened to spill, and she heard Pembroke continue with casual cruelty that perhaps the Duke required a companion for intellectual discourse and had wisely chosen a plain blue stocking who would be so grateful for his notice that she would never presume to expect actual romantic feeling. A sensible arrangement, really, when one considered that Ashworth surely had no intention of actually marrying the woman, but was merely passing time in an unconventional manner until a suitable duchess presented herself. The words landed with the force of physical blows, and what made them so devastating was not their novelty, but rather how perfectly they articulated the fears that had plagued Eleanor's own thoughts during every sleepless night since Alexander's attentions had begun. The terrible suspicion that this could not possibly be real, that she was participating in some elaborate drama whose true purpose remained hidden from her. She managed to set down the glass and retreat to the ladies' retiring room before anyone could witness the tears that threatened, and she sat in the small antechamber staring at her reflection in the gilt mirror and seeing exactly what the Viscount had described. A woman of 28 with unremarkable features and no particular claim to beauty, the sort of woman who should be grateful for any attention at all, and certainly had no right to expect the genuine regard of a duke. When her mother found her 20 minutes later and insisted they return to the ballroom because Alexander had arrived and was asking for her, Eleanor felt something inside herself, closing like a door pulled shut against winter wind. And though she returned and smiled and accepted Alexander's request for a dance, she felt herself retreating behind the protective walls she had so foolishly allowed to crumble, responding to his warm conversation with polite but distant courtesy that she could see confused and perhaps hurt him. During their waltz, as his hand rested with perfect propriety at her waist and his grey eyes searched her face with obvious concern, she could not bring herself to meet his gaze directly, because if she did, she feared she would break entirely. And when he asked quietly if something was wrong, she assured him with practiced lightness that she was merely fatigued, watching something shift in his expression that looked remarkably like disappointment, before he nodded and did not press further, leaving Eleanor to wonder with sick certainty whether she had just seen the beginning of his withdrawal, the inevitable conclusion of whatever game or charitable project she had unknowingly been participating in all along. Alexander Sinclair noticed Eleanor's withdrawal with the precision of a man who had learned to read the subtle language of grief and disappointment in the 2 years since his wife's death. And when he arrived at Lady Harrington's ball the following evening and observed Viscount Pembroke holding court near the card-room with that particular expression of smug satisfaction that suggested recent mischief, he understood with sudden clarity exactly what had occurred to cause Eleanor's retreat. He had spent the previous night unable to sleep, replaying their waltz and the way she had refused to meet his eyes, the careful politeness that had replaced the growing warmth between them, and he had felt something he had not experienced since his youth, a fierce protective anger at the thought of someone wounding a person he had come to care for deeply. The Duke of Ashworth was not a man given to public displays or social confrontation. His grief had made him even more private than his natural temperament dictated, but as he watched Pembroke gesture expansively while his companions laughed at some witticism, Alexander felt a cold determination settle in his chest like ice forming on a winter pond. He crossed the ballroom with deliberate purpose, his tall frame cutting through the crowd with an authority that made people step aside instinctively, and the conversations around him began to falter as society's most perceptive observers recognized that something significant was about to occur. He stopped directly before Pembroke's circle with such commanding presence that the Viscount's laughter died mid-sound, and Alexander said in a voice that carried with perfect aristocratic clarity to every corner of that section of the ballroom that he wished to address a matter of some importance regarding the proper conduct expected of gentlemen. Pembroke's face shifted from surprise to wariness as Alexander continued with devastating courtesy that he had observed a troubling trend among certain members of the ton, specifically the tendency of those with little substance to compensate for their own inadequacies by diminishing others, a practice he found not merely distasteful, but indicative of profound weakness of character. He noted that he had recently had occasion to witness Viscount Pembroke engage in such behavior, repeatedly offering uninvited commentary on a lady of impeccable character and considerable depth, and he wished to clarify for all present that such commentary reflected entirely on the poverty of the Viscount's own judgment rather than on the lady in question. The silence in the ballroom had become absolute, every fan stilled and every conversation abandoned as London's elite recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. A duke publicly cutting down a viscount with words as precise as surgical instruments. Alexander continued that he found it remarkable how often those who possessed only superficial charm mistook it for actual worth, and how those incapable of appreciating intelligence or character inevitably dismissed what they lacked the depth to comprehend. And he suggested that Pembroke might benefit from reflecting on why a man of true discernment would naturally be drawn to qualities of substance rather than mere surface decoration, though he doubted the Viscount possessed sufficient self-awareness for such reflection to bear fruit. Eleanor spent the 3 days following Alexander's public defense of her honor in a state of profound internal turmoil that left her unable to eat properly or sleep for more than a few restless hours each night, because while all of London buzzed with talk of how the Duke of Ashworth had cut down Viscount Pembroke with such devastating precision that the man had left Lady Harrington's ball in humiliated retreat, Eleanor found herself unable to simply accept this grand gesture as proof of Alexander's genuine regard. The years of dismissal and disappointment having carved channels in her heart that directed every hopeful thought back toward doubt and self-protection. She wanted desperately to believe that a man like Alexander could truly see value in someone like her, but 28 years of being overlooked had taught her that extraordinary gestures often preceded equally devastating disappointments, and she tortured herself with questions about whether his defense had been motivated by true feeling or simply by a gentleman's instinctive protection of any lady maligned in his presence. On the afternoon of the 18th of October, as Eleanor sat in the small parlor of the Whitmore residence, attempting without success to focus on her needlework, her sister Lydia arrived unexpectedly without her husband, and Eleanor noticed immediately that her younger sister's legendary beauty seemed somehow dimmed. The luminous quality that had made Lydia the toast of her debut season replaced by something brittle and tired, despite her being only 24 years old and married less than 2 years to the handsome and sought-after Mr. Thomas Carstairs. Lydia dismissed their mother's questions about Thomas's absence with practiced lightness, claiming he had business matters to attend to, but when the sisters were finally alone, Lydia's careful composure crumbled like sun-dried clay, and she confessed with raw honesty that her marriage had become a source of profound loneliness, that Thomas had married her for her beauty, as she had married him for his handsome face and charming manner, and they had discovered too late that surface attractions provided no foundation whatsoever for actual partnership or understanding. She described evenings spent in silent dinners because they had nothing of substance to discuss, the way Thomas grew bored whenever she attempted to speak of anything beyond social pleasantries, how she had realized with dawning horror that she had been collected like a beautiful ornament to decorate his life rather than chosen as a companion for his heart. And she looked at Eleanor with eyes that held both regret and something that looked remarkably like envy, as she said that she had spent years pitying her older sister's lack of suitors while being pursued by dozens of men herself. But she now understood that Eleanor's fate of being overlooked by the shallow had perhaps been a blessing in disguise, because it meant that any man who finally did see her would be seeing something real and lasting, rather than merely admiring a pretty surface destined to fade. The invitation arrived on the morning of the 22nd of October, delivered by the Duke's own footman in his distinctive livery of deep burgundy and gold, and Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she broke the crimson wax seal bearing the Ashworth crest to discover that Alexander requested her presence that very evening at his London residence for what he described as a private musical performance he had arranged in her honor, specifically noting that the invitation was extended to her alone rather than to the entire Whitmore family, a departure from protocol that made Eleanor's mother press her lips together with worry, even as she insisted that Eleanor must, of course, accept. Eleanor spent the remainder of the day in a state of nervous anticipation that manifested in her changing her dress 3 times before settling on a gown of deep sapphire silk that her mother had insisted she commissioned the previous season, despite Eleanor's protests that the rich color was too fine for someone of her unremarkable appearance. Though as she studied herself in the mirror that evening, she thought perhaps the shade brought a certain depth to her grey eyes that she had not noticed before. The Duke's London residence on Grosvenor Square was as elegant as Eleanor had imagined, all classical proportions and understated magnificence. But Alexander met her himself at the entrance rather than allowing servants to escort her, and the warm welcome in his dark eyes steadied something anxious in her chest as he offered his arm and guided her not to the formal music room she had expected, but to a more intimate salon, where she discovered a string quartet already assembled. The musicians poised with their instruments in a space lit by what must have been 50 candles that filled the room with golden light and the faint sweet scent of beeswax. Alexander explained as he seated her in one of the 2 chairs positioned to face the musicians, that he had spent the past week in consultation with the music masters at the Royal Academy, describing to them the pieces he had heard Eleanor discuss with such evident passion during their conversations, and he had engaged this particular quartet because they specialized in the works of the composers she most admired, specifically Mozart and Handel, whose complex harmonies she had once described to him as sounding like mathematics made beautiful. As the first notes of Mozart's String Quartet No. 17 in B-flat major filled the salon, Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, because this particular piece was one she had mentioned only once in passing during a walk in Hyde Park 2 weeks earlier, a composition she had described as capturing something essential about the possibility of joy, even in complexity. And the fact that Alexander had not only remembered this single comment, but had gone to such extraordinary lengths to arrange for her to hear it performed live in such intimate surroundings, broke through the careful walls she had constructed around her heart with the irresistible force of floodwater finally overwhelming a dam. The quartet completed their performance of the Mozart piece and moved seamlessly into a Handel concerto, and Eleanor sat in perfect stillness as the music washed over her, awareness expanding beyond the notes themselves to encompass the extraordinary thoughtfulness required for Alexander to have arranged this entire evening around the fragments of conversation she had barely remembered sharing with him. And when the final notes faded into silence and the musicians quietly departed with respectful bows, she found herself alone with Alexander in the candlelit salon, with her heart beating so forcefully she was certain he must hear it in the sudden quiet. He moved to sit in the chair beside her, rather than maintaining the formal distance. Protocol would dictate, close enough that she could detect the subtle scent of sandalwood and something else uniquely him. And for a long moment, neither spoke, as the weight of unspoken feeling filled the space between them like a presence of its own substance and texture. Eleanor knew she stood at a precipice, that she could retreat back into the safe resignation that had protected her for so many years, or she could step forward into the terrifying vulnerability of honest expression, and she discovered that Lydia's words about the hollowness of surface beauty, combined with this evening's demonstration of genuine understanding, had shifted something fundamental in her capacity for courage. She turned to face Alexander directly, her grey eyes meeting his dark ones without the shields she usually employed, and her voice emerged quieter than she intended, but steady as she told him that she needed to speak plainly, even if such directness violated every rule of proper feminine conduct, because she could not continue this dance of courtship without understanding his true intentions and motivations. She confessed with painful honesty that every kindness he showed her, every attention he paid, existed in her mind against the constant backdrop of Viscount Pembroke's assessment of her as plain and unmarriageable that she had spent 28 years learning the precise limitations of her appeal and value in society's eyes, and while she wanted desperately to believe his interest was genuine, she could not silence the voice that whispered she must be some sort of project or charitable endeavor, a woman he pitied rather than desired, an object of his benevolence rather than his affection. The words, once released, seemed to hang in the air between them, and Eleanor braced herself for the polite reassurances, or worse, the confirmation of her fears. But Alexander's expression transformed into something raw and unguarded as he leaned forward and took her hands in his with a gentleness that contradicted the intensity burning in his eyes. He told her in a voice roughened by emotion that he would speak with equal honesty, even if such vulnerability was not the habit of dukes or men trained to maintain aristocratic reserve. And he confessed that after his wife's death, 2 years earlier, he had believed himself permanently sealed away from genuine feeling, going through the motions of his responsibilities while experiencing nothing but a grey emptiness where his heart had once resided. He explained that watching her at the opera that first evening, seeing her absorb the Viscount's cruelty with such quiet dignity, and then turn back to the performance with undiminished attention to the music, had cracked something open in the frozen landscape of his grief. And in the weeks since he had found himself thinking not of duty or obligation, but of the particular way her eyes lit when she spoke of something that moved her, the intelligence and depth of feeling he saw in her that society dismissed because it could not be captured in the crude measurements of conventional beauty. He told her that she had awakened him to the possibility of genuine connection again, and if she could not yet see her own extraordinary value, then he would simply have to continue demonstrating it until she believed what he already knew with complete certainty, that she was precisely the woman he wanted, not despite her differences from society's shallow ideals, but because of the substance and grace that made her unlike anyone he had ever known. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, and Eleanor saw in his eyes an intention that made her breath catch as he leaned closer, his hand rising to touch her face with a tenderness that made her eyelids flutter closed in anticipation. But the sharp sound of the salon door opening shattered the intimacy as Alexander's butler appeared with profuse apologies about an urgent matter requiring the Duke's immediate attention. And though Alexander dismissed the interruption with barely concealed frustration, the spell was broken, and Eleanor found herself returned home an hour later with her emotions in beautiful chaos and her certainty about his feelings finally preciously secured. But the following morning brought complications that Eleanor had not anticipated, beginning with her mother's appearance in her bedroom before breakfast with an expression of maternal anxiety that Eleanor had learned to recognize as the precursor to difficult conversations. And Mrs. Whitmore settled herself on the edge of Eleanor's bed to express concerns that had apparently kept her wakeful through much of the night about whether the Duke was perhaps merely amusing himself with Eleanor's company, whether a man of his position would truly contemplate a permanent attachment to a woman who brought neither great beauty nor significant fortune to such an alliance, and whether Eleanor was perhaps allowing hope to blind her to the likelihood of eventual heartbreak. The words, though spoken with loving concern, reopened wounds that Alexander's declarations had begun to heal, and Eleanor's attempts to convey the depth and sincerity of what had passed between them the previous evening met with her mother's skeptical observation that men of rank often believed their own sentiments in the moment without such feelings necessarily leading to honorable proposals. The conversation left Eleanor shaken and uncertain despite her desire to trust in what she had seen in Alexander's eyes, and her disquiet only increased when she accompanied her mother and Lydia to Lady Pemberton's drawing-room that afternoon for tea, and found herself the subject of speculation among the assembled society matrons, whose observations, delivered in voices pitched to seem confidential, but carefully calibrated to reach Eleanor's ears, suggested that the Duke's attentions were widely viewed as an eccentric whim that would inevitably pass once he returned to his senses and remembered his duty to contract an alliance appropriate to his station and consequence. Lady Pemberton herself joined the conversation with observations about how Eleanor must be enjoying this unusual attention while it lasted, and though the words were delivered with a smile, their implication was clear enough that Eleanor felt the familiar weight of social judgment settle back onto her shoulders with crushing force. And by the time she returned home that afternoon, her fragile confidence had eroded to the point that she found herself wondering whether her mother and the society matrons were perhaps correct in their assessment that she was foolishly mistaking temporary interest for genuine commitment. The following day brought no word from Alexander, and though Eleanor knew perfectly well that various demands on a duke's time might account for his absence, the silence felt increasingly ominous as the hours passed, and the doubts planted by her mother and reinforced by Lady Pemberton's drawing room took deeper root in the fertile soil of her lifelong insecurities about her worth and desirability. By the second day without communication, Eleanor had nearly convinced herself that the entire courtship had been exactly what she had feared from the beginning, some incomprehensible whim or charitable impulse that Alexander had now recognized as impractical and inappropriate, and she was preparing herself for the inevitable polite withdrawal when a footman arrived with a letter bearing the Ashworth seal and a request that Eleanor present herself at the Royal Opera House at 8 o'clock that evening, alone if she was willing to trust him with such an irregular arrangement, with a carriage sent to convey her safely. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the brief message, and though her mother expressed alarm at the impropriety of an unmarried woman meeting a gentleman on in the evening, something in the careful phrasing of Alexander's request convinced Eleanor that whatever he intended to communicate required privacy and the specific setting of the opera house itself, and she found herself agreeing, despite every rule of proper conduct suggesting she should decline. The Duke's carriage arrived precisely at the appointed hour, and Eleanor made the journey through the London streets with her heart alternating between hope and dread, uncertain whether she was travelling toward a declaration or a gentle dismissal. And when she arrived at the opera house, she found it dark and apparently empty, except for a single attendant who escorted her through the silent corridors to the private box where she had first sat as Alexander's guest all those weeks ago. Alexander stood waiting in the box, and the candlelight illuminated his expression with a warmth that immediately eased her worst fears, and he took her hands in his and told her that he had something to show her, something he hoped would answer the doubts he suspected she harbored about the sincerity of his feelings and intentions. He guided her attention to a brass plaque newly installed on the entrance to the box, and Eleanor leaned forward to read the engraving that proclaimed this space as the Whitmore box, dedicated in honor of Eleanor Whitmore. And when she turned to him in confusion, he explained that he wanted her to understand why he had purchased the Royal Opera House, a decision that had mystified London society and prompted endless speculation about his motivations and mental state. Alexander explained that when he witnessed the Viscount's cruelty toward her that evening weeks ago, watching her absorb those cutting words with such dignity before returning her attention to the music she loved, something had shifted in him that he had not fully understood until much later, and in the days that followed, he found himself unable to forget the image of her quiet grace in the face of such thoughtless malice. He told her that he had purchased the Royal Opera House not as an investment or a whim, but because he could not bear the thought that she might forever associate a place of such beauty with the memory of being diminished and dismissed, and if he possessed the means to transform that association, then he considered it not an extravagance, but a necessity, a way of ensuring that when she attended the opera in future, she would enter not as someone merely tolerated by society, but as someone honored in the very architecture of the building itself. Eleanor felt tears gathering as she looked again at the plaque bearing her name, understanding now the magnitude of what he had done, and the depth of feeling that had motivated such an extraordinary gesture. And when she turned back to him, her vision was blurred, but her heart was more certain than it had ever been. Alexander took both her hands in his and drew her closer, and in the intimate candlelight of the box where their story had truly begun, he told her that he had brought her here tonight because he had a question to ask her, one that required a setting equal to its importance, and he wanted her to hear his proposal in a place that now belonged to her as much as it belonged to him. He said that in the months of their acquaintance, she had given him something he thought he had lost forever when his wife died. Not a replacement for what he had loved before, but something new and equally precious. A connection built not on the superficial attractions that society prized, but on genuine recognition and understanding and shared passion for the things that gave life meaning beyond mere appearance or status. He told her that when he looked at her, he saw intelligence and sensitivity and a capacity for deep feeling that most people spent their entire lives never developing, and he considered himself not her benefactor or patron, but rather the grateful recipient of her attention and regard, profoundly fortunate that circumstances had allowed their paths to cross at a moment when both of them were ready to recognize in each other what they had been seeking. Then Alexander lowered himself to one knee in the box that bore her name, and in a voice steady with conviction, he asked Eleanor Whitmore if she would consent to become his wife, to share his life and his name and his determination to build a partnership founded on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than the empty conventions that governed most society marriages. He promised that if she accepted him, she would never again have to endure the casual cruelty of people too limited to recognize her worth, not because he would shelter her from the world, but because together they would demonstrate through the happiness and harmony of their union that society's narrow definitions of value were meaningless when measured against the substance of true connection. Eleanor's acceptance came not in elaborate words, but in a simple affirmative spoken through tears of joy and relief. And as Alexander rose from his knee and drew her into his arms, she felt the weight of every cruel judgment and dismissive glance she had endured over 28 years lift from her shoulders as though it had never existed, replaced by the certainty that she was genuinely loved, not despite her perceived shortcomings, but for the person she actually was beneath society's shallow assessments. The news of their engagement spread through London with the speed and intensity of wildfire, and by the following afternoon, every drawing room in fashionable society buzzed with speculation and commentary about the surprising match between the distinguished Duke of Ashworth and the decidedly unremarkable Eleanor Whitmore, with reactions ranging from genuine happiness for the couple to barely concealed astonishment that such an eligible gentleman had chosen so unconventional a bride. Eleanor's mother wept with joy and relief when Alexander formally requested her blessing, expressing gratitude that her elder daughter would not face the lonely fate of permanent spinsterhood that had seemed inevitable mere months earlier. And though Eleanor might have once felt wounded by her mother's transparent relief, she now understood it as simply a parent's concern for a child's welfare within the limited framework of understanding her mother possessed. Lydia embraced her sister with unfeigned delight, and whispered that Eleanor had found something far more valuable than the surface attractions that had determined Lydia's own marital choice. And in her younger sister's eyes, Eleanor saw both happiness and a trace of wistful envy for the genuine partnership Eleanor had secured. The formal announcement appeared in the Morning Post and was received with various degrees of enthusiasm across the social spectrum, with Alexander's true friends expressing pleasure that he had found companionship after his years of grief, while those more concerned with status and convention struggled to understand what had prompted such an unexpected alliance. Viscount Pembroke received the news while taking breakfast at his club, and reportedly went quite pale before retreating from the dining room without finishing his meal, and within days it became apparent that his social standing had suffered considerably from his public humiliation at Alexander's hands, and his well-known animosity toward the woman who would now be the Duchess of Ashworth, a position that placed her decidedly beyond his capacity for casual cruelty. Several society matrons who had previously dismissed Eleanor with faint contempt now scrambled to repair their relationships with her, suddenly remembering previous acquaintance and expressing delight at her good fortune with a transparency that might have been amusing had it not revealed so clearly the superficial values that governed their world. Lady Pemberton herself called at the Whitmore residence to offer strained congratulations, and Eleanor received her with perfect courtesy but without the desperate gratitude for attention that might once have characterized her response to notice from such an elevated source, her newfound confidence evident in the gracious but reserved manner with which she accepted the older woman's poorly concealed surprise. Alexander's own social circle welcomed Eleanor with considerably more warmth, particularly those friends who had worried about his prolonged isolation after his wife's death, and who recognized in his bearing a renewed engagement with life that spoke well of his choice. The weeks that followed the engagement announcement passed in a whirlwind of wedding preparations that transformed Eleanor's daily existence from quiet routine into elaborate activity. Yet through it all, what struck her most profoundly was not the selection of fabrics or the planning of menus, but rather the internal shift that occurred as she gradually allowed herself to fully believe in the reality of her happiness and the genuineness of Alexander's devotion. He called upon her daily, and in those visits Eleanor discovered a tenderness in him that had only been hinted at during their courtship, a careful attention to her comfort and preferences that made it clear he viewed their approaching marriage not as the acquisition of a wife to fill a vacant position, but as the beginning of a genuine partnership built on mutual care and consideration. When the modiste arrived with samples of silk and lace for the wedding gown, Alexander insisted on being consulted about Eleanor's preferences, and though propriety dictated he should not see the finished garment before the ceremony, he made certain that every decision reflected her taste, rather than simply conforming to what fashion dictated or what would impress society observers. Eleanor found herself choosing a gown of ivory silk with delicate embroidery that pleased her aesthetic sensibility, rather than the more elaborate confection her mother initially suggested, and Alexander's approval of her choice gave her confidence that her instincts about beauty and appropriateness were valid, despite years of being told implicitly that her judgment in such matters was suspect. The most meaningful moments of preparation came not in the grand decisions about the ceremony itself, but in smaller choices that revealed the life they would build together, particularly the selection of music for both the wedding ceremony and the breakfast that would follow. Alexander arranged for them to meet with the musical director of the Royal Opera House, and together they spent an entire afternoon discussing which pieces would best express the significance of the occasion, with Eleanor's knowledge of composers and Alexander's genuine interest in her opinions creating a collaboration that felt like a preview of their future harmony. She suggested a particular Mozart piece for the moment when she would walk down the aisle, explaining that its combination of joy and solemnity captured what she felt about the commitment they were making, and Alexander listened with such focused attention that she felt truly heard in a way she had never experienced in any previous interaction with a man. In quieter moments when they walked in the park or sat in the Whitmore drawing room with appropriate chaperonage, Alexander would take her hand and speak of his vision for their life together, describing not grand social ambitions, but simple domestic happiness, evenings spent in conversation and music, the possibility of children who would be raised to value character over appearance and substance over status. The morning of Eleanor's wedding dawned with crystalline clarity, sunlight streaming through her bedroom window as if heaven itself had conspired to illuminate this day that had once seemed an impossible dream, and as her maid helped her into the ivory silk gown with its delicate embroidery, she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror and saw not the plain spinster society had dismissed, but a woman who was genuinely loved and who had learned at last to recognize her own worth, independent of others' judgments. The bodice fit perfectly, the silk cool and smooth against her skin, and the lace veil that had belonged to her grandmother seemed to catch the morning light and transform it into something luminous and sacred, while the small bouquet of white roses and jasmine that Alexander had specifically requested filled the room with a fragrance that would forever after be associated in her mind with this moment of transformation. Her mother wept as she fastened the pearl necklace that had been in the family for 3 generations, and even Lydia, who had always been the acknowledged beauty of the family, looked at Eleanor with something approaching awe as she whispered that she had never seen anyone look so radiant, and Eleanor understood that what showed in her face was not physical perfection, but rather the illumination that comes from being truly seen and cherished by another person. The carriage ride to St. George's in Hanover Square passed in a blur of emotion and sensory impression. The streets of London crowded with ordinary people going about their morning business, while Eleanor travelled toward the most extraordinary moment of her life. And when the church came into view with its imposing columns and the crowd of fashionable society gathered on its steps, she felt a momentary return of her old anxiety that this was somehow a mistake or an elaborate dream from which she would soon awaken. But then she saw Alexander standing at the altar in his formal attire, and the expression on his face as she began her slow walk down the aisle, accompanied by the Mozart piece they had selected together, dissolved any remaining doubt, for no one could look at another person with such transparent love and devotion unless the feeling was absolutely genuine and deeply rooted. The church was filled with flowers and the scent of beeswax candles, and the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows painted the marble floors with pools of colored radiance that seemed to bless each step Eleanor took toward her future, while the assembled guests who represented the pinnacle of London society watched a union that defied their conventional understanding of appropriate matches and forced them to witness the triumph of character over superficial attraction. When Eleanor reached the altar and Alexander took her hand, his fingers trembled slightly with emotion, and as the ceremony proceeded with its ancient words and solemn vows, she felt the weight of every limitation that had been placed upon her throughout her life fall away completely, replaced by the profound recognition that she was entering into a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than social convenience or physical attraction. The wedding breakfast held at Ashworth House was an affair of such elegance and warmth that even the most critical members of society found themselves charmed by the genuine happiness that radiated from both bride and groom, and as Eleanor moved through the reception rooms, greeting guests with Alexander always at her side, she felt the mantle of her new position settling upon her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a natural extension of who she had always been, beneath the layers of self-doubt that society had imposed upon her. The Duke's London residence was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, with soaring ceilings and windows that flooded the rooms with afternoon light, and Eleanor had worked with the household staff to fill every space with flowers and music, so that the celebration felt less like a formal social obligation and more like an authentic expression of joy. Alexander's hand rested at the small of her back as they moved from group to group, a gesture of both support and possession that announced to everyone present that he was genuinely proud to have her as his wife. And when the elderly Duchess of Somerset, who had been a particular friend of his late wife, approached with what Eleanor feared might be cool judgment, she instead found herself embraced warmly and told that Alexander had chosen extraordinarily well, and that his first wife would have approved completely of a woman of such substance and character. The meal itself was a triumph of culinary art, accompanied by the musical selections Eleanor had so carefully chosen. And when Alexander rose to offer a toast to his bride, his words were not the conventional pleasantries expected at such occasions, but rather a heartfelt tribute to Eleanor's intelligence, kindness, and the profound impact she had already made upon his life in the months since their first meeting at the opera. As the afternoon faded into evening and guests began to depart, Eleanor felt the first flutter of nervousness about the wedding night that awaited them, for despite their emotional intimacy and the genuine love that existed between them, she remained inexperienced in physical matters and uncertain about what would be expected of her. Alexander seemed to sense her anxiety, and when they finally retired to the private apartments that had been prepared for them, he took her hands and spoke with such gentleness about his desire to ensure her comfort and happiness that her fear transformed into anticipation. The bedroom was softly lit with candles, and the curtains had been left partially open so that moonlight streamed across the carpet. And as Alexander helped her remove the pins from her hair with careful fingers, she felt a tenderness in his touch that spoke of patience and genuine care for her well-being rather than mere physical desire. Their coming together was a gradual unfolding of intimacy that honored both Eleanor's inexperience and the emotional connection they had built over months of conversation and courtship. And when Alexander whispered against her skin that she was beautiful in every way that truly mattered, she finally believed him completely and allowed herself to experience the full depth of physical and emotional union without reservation or doubt. The days that followed established the pattern of their married life, with Eleanor discovering that being Duchess of Ashworth meant not conforming to some predetermined role, but rather bringing her authentic self to the position and allowing her natural grace, intelligence, and warmth to shape how she engaged with both household management and social obligations, while Alexander proved himself to be not a distant aristocratic husband, but a genuine partner who sought her opinion on matters of estate business and political concern. 6 months into their marriage, Eleanor had transformed Ashworth House from a place of quiet mourning into a residence that hummed with culture and warmth, and the change was most evident in the music salon she had established every Thursday evening, where the finest musicians and most thoughtful members of society gathered not for empty social display but for genuine appreciation of art and intelligent conversation. Alexander would often position himself near the doorway during these evenings, simply to watch Eleanor move through the assembled guests with a confidence that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep within her, the way she listened with complete attention when the violinist explained his interpretation of a particular passage, or how she gently drew out a shy young composer who had been invited to share his work, and he marveled at how thoroughly she had grown into her role as Duchess, while never losing the essential qualities of character that had first drawn his attention. The household staff adored her because she treated them with genuine respect and took time to learn their individual concerns, the housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, having confided to Alexander that in all her 30 years of service she had never known a mistress who combined such natural authority with such warmth and consideration for those beneath her in station. On a particular Thursday in late November, as the first snow of the season fell softly past the windows, and the salon filled with the sound of a string quartet performing, Haydn, Eleanor caught Alexander's eye across the room and smiled with such unguarded happiness that he felt his heart constrict with gratitude for the impulse that had led him to truly see her that night at the opera, when everyone else had looked past her toward more conventional beauties. After the guests had departed and the musicians had been thanked and compensated generously, Alexander found Eleanor in the music room standing by the pianoforte, with her hand resting lightly on the polished wood, and when he approached and wrapped his arms around her from behind, she leaned back against him with a contentment that needed no words to express its depth. They had established a ritual of ending these evenings together in comfortable silence, sometimes discussing a particular performance or guest, but more often simply existing in the peaceful intimacy of shared space. And on this night, Eleanor turned in his arms and informed him, with a mixture of joy and nervousness, that she believed she was carrying their child. Alexander's response was immediate and tender, his hands moving to cradle her face as he kissed her, with a reverence that acknowledged the profound significance of this news. And then he led her to the settee where they sat together, planning and dreaming about the future, while the fire burned low and the snow continued its quiet descent outside. Eleanor admitted that she had worried whether she would be able to conceive given her age and the years of believing herself destined for spinsterhood, but Alexander reminded her that she had already defied every limitation society had tried to impose, and that this was simply one more beautiful surprise in a marriage built on genuine love rather than conventional expectations. The weeks that followed brought a deepening of their already strong bond, as Alexander proved himself to be not just attentive, but genuinely fascinated by every aspect of Eleanor's pregnancy, reading medical texts to understand what she was experiencing and ensuring that she had everything necessary for her comfort, while never treating her as fragile or incapable of continuing the activities that brought her joy. A full year after that painful evening when she had overheard Viscount Pembroke declare her plain and unmarriageable, Eleanor returned to the Royal Opera House on Alexander's arm, her pregnancy now visible beneath the exquisite sapphire silk gown he had commissioned for her. And as they entered the grand foyer, she felt none of the old anxiety that had once accompanied her visits to this place, but rather a quiet confidence born of genuine love and the knowledge that she had built a life of substance and meaning beyond anything she had dared imagine during those lonely years of resignation. The opera house itself seemed transformed by her changed perspective, the gilt and crystal no longer symbols of a glittering world from which she was excluded, but simply beautiful architectural details to be appreciated. And when the crowd parted to allow the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth passage to their private box, Eleanor noted with detached interest how many of the same people who had once looked through her now offered respectful greetings and genuine smiles of admiration. Alexander's hand rested protectively at her back as they climbed the stairs, and she felt the child move within her as if responding to the music that was already beginning to drift from the orchestra pit, a moment of such perfect contentment that she had to pause and simply breathe in the wonder of how completely her life had changed. As they settled into their box, the very same box where Alexander had first truly seen her and where he had later proposed, Eleanor's eye caught movement across the theatre, and she recognized Viscount Pembroke entering with a party that included several young women and their chaperones, his expression carrying that same superficial charm that masked the cruelty she now understood had always stemmed from his own emptiness rather than any deficiency in those he mocked. Alexander followed her gaze, and his hand found hers, squeezing gently in a gesture of support, but Eleanor discovered that she felt no anger or desire for the Viscount to witness her triumph, only a mild pity for a man so limited in his understanding of what truly mattered that he had built his entire identity on the shifting sands of conventional beauty and social posturing. The lights dimmed and the performance began, a sublime rendering of Mozart that Eleanor had been anticipating for weeks, and as the music filled the space, she felt Alexander's thumb trace gentle circles on her palm, while his other hand moved to rest lightly on the curve of her belly where their child grew. During the first interval when society traditionally paraded through the corridors to see and be seen, Alexander asked if she wished to remain in the privacy of their box or join the promenade, and Eleanor chose to walk with him through the crowded spaces because she had learned that hiding from society gave it power over her while engaging with it on her own terms, affirmed her right to occupy space in the world without apology or shame. The Duchess of Somerset stopped them to inquire warmly about Eleanor's health, and to insist that she must call once the child was born, and Lady Harrington, who had been one of the most vocal skeptics of the match, admitted that the Thursday music salons at Ashworth House had become the highlight of her week, and that Eleanor had brought genuine culture back to a society too often focused on empty spectacle. They passed within a few feet of Viscount Pembroke, who appeared to be holding forth to a captive audience about some trivial matter, and Eleanor felt his eyes upon her for a brief moment before Alexander smoothly guided her past without acknowledgement, the cut delivered not through confrontation, but through the simple demonstration that the Viscount's opinions held no power over their happiness and warranted no attention whatsoever. 5 years after that transformative evening when Viscount Pembroke's cruelty had inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that would reshape her entire existence, Eleanor stood in the private box at the Royal Opera House, with her hand resting on the shoulder of her eldest daughter, Catherine, who at 4 years old already showed signs of her mother's thoughtful nature and love of music, while her son William, just 2, dozed contentedly in Alexander's arms as the final notes of a Beethoven symphony filled the gilded space with transcendent beauty. Eleanor had made it a tradition to bring the children to carefully selected performances, wanting them to grow up understanding that places of culture belonged to them not by virtue of their title or appearance, but because beauty and art were birthrights available to all who approached with open hearts and minds. As she watched Catherine's small face absorbed in concentration, Eleanor reflected on how completely her understanding of her own worth had been transformed not by Alexander's love alone, though that had been the catalyst, but by the gradual recognition that the limitations she had accepted for were so long as were never truths about her value, but merely reflections of a society too shallow to perceive substance beneath surface. Alexander caught her eye over their son's sleeping form, and smiled with the intimate warmth of a man who had found in marriage not just contentment, but daily discovery, and Eleanor felt the familiar swell of gratitude for the courage she had found to accept love when it arrived in a form she had not anticipated, and from a direction she had not been watching. The opera house itself stood as a monument to the truth that grand gestures mattered less than the consistent, small choices to see and value another person, for while society still spoke of the Duke who had purchased a theatre for the woman he loved, Eleanor knew the real gift had been his willingness to look past convention and recognize her worth when she had almost stopped recognizing it herself. As the audience began to applaud, and Catherine clapped her small hands together with enthusiastic, if not quite rhythmic joy, Eleanor thought about all the women who even now sat in various corners of this theatre, believing themselves invisible or dismissed or past the possibility of transformation, and she wished she could speak directly to each of them to say that the stories society tells about who deserves love and happiness and recognition are lies built on foundations of arbitrary standards that shift with fashion and serve no purpose but to maintain hierarchies that benefit only the shallow and cruel. Your worth is not diminished by time or circumstance, or the failure of others to perceive it, Eleanor would tell them, and it is never too late for life to surprise you with beauty and love if you can maintain the courage to remain open to possibility, even after disappointment has taught you to expect nothing. Alexander shifted William to his other arm and reached for Eleanor's hand, and as they prepared to leave the box and return to the home they had built together, a home filled with music and laughter and the daily practices of genuine partnership, Eleanor sent a silent blessing toward her younger self, who had sat in these seats feeling invisible and hopeless, grateful beyond measure that she had maintained enough dignity and openness to recognize love when it finally saw her clearly.